Hey guys, tonight we're going to gently lower ourselves into a time when the concept of personal hygiene was more of a vague suggestion than a daily routine. Specifically, we're talking about medieval Europe, a period famous for castles, knights, illuminated manuscripts, and a rather complicated relationship with soap. Now, before we begin, just a soft reminder. If you enjoy this kind of slow, slightly grim, and extremely sleepy history, remember to quietly subscribe. No sudden movements, just a calm, medieval click. So, why wouldn't you survive medieval hygiene even for a week? Let's start with the obvious. Bathing was not a daily event. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, large public bathhouses fell out of fashion. The Romans, for all their flaws, had been very enthusiastic about bathing. The medieval period, less so. Public baths still existed in some cities during the early Middle Ages, but over time they gained a certain reputation, and not the wholesome kind. By the 14th and 15th centuries, public bathhouses were increasingly associated with moral suspicion. Some church authorities warned that frequent bathing encouraged vanity. Others quietly worried about what else might be happening in those steamy rooms. So bathing became, in some circles, something you did occasionally, carefully, perhaps once every few weeks or months, or when absolutely necessary. Instead of regular full-body baths, many people practiced what we might generously call selective washing. Hands and face. Maybe a quick rinse with a basin of cold water. Soap, when available, was often harsh and used mainly for laundry. Fine soaps made from olive oil existed in places like southern France and parts of Spain, but they were expensive and not exactly a daily indulgence for peasants. For most people, clothing did a lot of the work. Linen undergarments were worn beneath wool outer layers, and linen had the helpful property of absorbing sweat and oils. The logic was simple. If you changed your linen, you were technically clean. The body beneath? Well, it was being handled indirectly. Now imagine living in a crowded medieval city. Streets were narrow. Houses leaned toward each other like tired old men sharing secrets. Waste disposal systems were inconsistent at best. Chamber pots were a standard household feature. Their contents were often emptied into the street, ideally with a warning shout. Ideally, the smell was not subtle. Add to this the presence of animals. Chickens wandered, pigs roamed freely in some towns, horses contributed steadily to the street's organic composition. Rain did wash things away from time to time, but it also created a rich, fragrant mud that had ambitions of entering your home. Inside, ventilation was limited. Fireplaces filled rooms with smoke. Windows were small and often shuttered. Floors might be covered in rushes, reeds or straw scattered to absorb spills. These rushes were sometimes replaced, not frequently. Teeth, you ask? Toothbrushes, as we know them, did not exist. Some people used cloths, twigs, or herbal powders to clean their teeth. Others simply did not. Dental decay was common. Breath freshness was, let's say, relative. And then there were lice. Lice were almost universal companions. They lived in clothing seams, in hair, in bedding. People picked them off casually, like removing lint. It was not considered shocking. It was Tuesday. Medieval medical theory did not necessarily help. The dominant framework was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was about balance. Illness was about imbalance. Bathing, some believed, could open the pores and allow disease to enter. Warm water, especially during times of plague, was treated with suspicion. Better to keep the pores politely closed. So, if you arrived from the 21st century with your expectations of daily showers, antibacterial soap, and breathable deodorant, the first thing that would hit you would not be the historical charm. It would be the air, and you would have to adjust slowly, because in medieval Europe, hygiene was not about eliminating every odor. It was about surviving within them, and we've only just stepped into the street. Now, once you have adjusted to the general atmosphere, which might take several days and a small emotional breakdown, you would begin to notice something else. Medieval people were not unaware of cleanliness. They simply defined it differently. Cleanliness was often visual. If your clothes looked tidy, if your hair was combed, if your hands were not visibly crusted in something agricultural, you were presentable. Smell was more complicated. When everyone shares roughly the same baseline scent of smoke, wool, humanity, and livestock, the threshold for offensive shifts dramatically. Perfumes existed, of course. The wealthy used scented oils, herbs, and pomanders, small balls filled with fragrant materials like cloves, ambergris, or rose petals. These were carried around to counteract unpleasant odors, which were believed not only to offend the nose, but to carry disease. Bad smells, according to the miasma theory, were dangerous. So instead of removing the source, many people simply layered better smells on top of worse ones, a kind of aromatic negotiation. For peasants, daily life involved physical labor: farming, hauling, weaving, blacksmithing. Sweat was unavoidable. Wool clothing trapped heat and moisture. Linen helped somewhat, but regular washing of clothes was labor-intensive. Water had to be drawn from wells or rivers. Firewood had to be gathered to heat it. Laundry day was not a quick, cheerful ritual. It was an exhausting logistical event. And in winter, bathing was even less appealing. Medieval homes were cold. Stone walls retained chill like a personal grudge. Heating a large tub of water required time, fuel, and patience. Then, after you bathed, you had to step out into air that was not interested in your comfort. Many simply chose not to. Hair washing was infrequent. Combs were common and important tools. Grooming often meant carefully combing out debris and parasites. Head coverings, coifs, veils, hats kept hair contained, which was both practical and conveniently obscured its condition. Let's discuss hands for a moment. Hand washing before meals was actually encouraged in many settings, particularly among the upper classes. Formal banquets often began with servants bringing around ewers of water and basins, so guests could rinse their hands. This was less about germ theory, still centuries away, and more about etiquette. You were about to eat with your fingers. Cleanish hands were appreciated. However, soap was still not universally gentle or abundant. It could be made from animal fat and lye, which was effective but not luxurious. Repeated use might irritate skin. So even when people washed, it wasn't the moisturizing spa experience you might imagine. Illness moved easily through these environments. Skin infections, fungal issues, and parasites thrived. Fleas carried diseases. Rats found medieval cities extremely welcoming. And when plague arrived in the 14th century, fear intensified around bathing. Many believed that hot water opened pores, making the body vulnerable to corrupted air. In a tragic twist, efforts to avoid illness sometimes increased exposure to filth. Now, Here is the quiet irony. Medieval people often believed they were quite clean compared to earlier or less civilized groups. Cleanliness was relative, contextual, and deeply shaped by available knowledge. They changed clothes when possible. They aired bedding. They valued fresh linens. They just did not equate hygiene with the near-sterile standards we chase today. If you, modern traveler, tried to introduce daily showers and scented body wash, you would quickly encounter practical barriers. Where would you find consistent hot water? How would you explain why you insist on washing your entire body every morning? People might politely assume you were ill, or eccentric, or possibly French, which at various points in history carried its own implications. And after a week, just 7 quiet, smoky, slightly itchy days, you might find yourself adapting. Your nose would dull. Your standards would recalibrate. You would stop flinching every time someone scratched their scalp thoughtfully, because survival in medieval hygiene was less about smelling like lavender and more about accepting that everyone else smelled like history. And once you have accepted that everyone smells faintly of history, smoke, and damp wool, you would begin to notice that medieval hygiene was also deeply tied to status. The wealthy had options, not unlimited options, but options. In larger medieval cities like London or Paris, affluent households could afford servants to haul water, heat it, and prepare a wooden tub in a private chamber. Bathing might be arranged occasionally, particularly before major religious holidays or important social events. Nobles also had access to imported soaps and fragrant herbs: rosemary, lavender, thyme. These were not just for cooking. They were strewn across floors, tucked into bedding, and rubbed onto skin in a gentle attempt to civilize the senses. But even then, bathing was not daily. It was deliberate, ceremonial almost, a rare interruption to the steady rhythm of living in layers. For everyone else, rivers were practical. In warmer months, people bathed outdoors, not necessarily in privacy. Modesty existed, but survival and convenience often negotiated with it. Waterways doubled as washing stations for clothes, tools, animals, and occasionally bodies. The concept of separating these functions with strict boundaries was not yet standard practice, which means that the same river, supporting your refreshingly brisk bath, may also have hosted a pig upstream. This was simply how things were. Inside homes, bedding was another quiet ecosystem. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, feathers if you were fortunate, and laid upon wooden frames. Over time, straw absorbed moisture, oils, and whatever else life contributed. It was replaced, but not frequently enough to satisfy a modern allergist. Fleas thrived in these warm, fibrous environments. Nighttime was, for many, an itchy negotiation. Medieval people scratched, casually, publicly, without apology. Head lice were so common that nitpicking was almost a social activity. Combs were shared. Families helped each other remove parasites. It was intimate in a way that modern hygiene campaigns might struggle to market. And yet, there were rules. Monasteries, for example, often maintained stricter standards. Some monastic orders allowed limited bathing at specific times of year. Cleanliness had symbolic meaning, purity, spiritual preparation, but excessive concern with the body could also be interpreted as vanity. The balance was subtle and occasionally confusing. In hospitals, early forms at least, hygiene was guided by prevailing medical theory rather than microscopic evidence. Physicians relied on classical authorities like Galen, whose writings emphasized humoral balance. Illness was treated with bloodletting, herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, not sterilization. Surgeries were performed without an understanding of bacteria. Instruments were wiped, perhaps rinsed, but not disinfected in any modern sense. Survival rates reflected this reality with calm indifference. If you developed a wound, infection was a very real possibility. Without antibiotics, even minor injuries could escalate. Clean water helped, but consistent sterile technique did not exist. The medieval world was not unaware of dirt. It simply did not connect dirt to disease in the way we now instinctively do. And here is where you might truly struggle, not just with the smells, not just with the lice, but with the constant physical closeness of it all. Clothing was rarely washed as often as modern wardrobes. Wool cloaks absorbed years of smoke from hearth fires. Leather boots retained the memory of every muddy road. Even churches, magnificent as they were, held the combined breath of hundreds of unbathed parishioners beneath stone vaults. The sensory density was profound. After a week, your skin might feel persistently coated, your scalp slightly restless, your clothes heavier than usual. You would begin to understand that medieval hygiene was not about achieving freshness. It was about managing inevitability. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson here. Medieval people were not ignorant or careless. They were practical. They worked with what they had: limited water infrastructure, labor-intensive heating, inherited medical theory, and a world in which survival required energy better spent on crops than on soap. You would not survive medieval hygiene for a week because it was shocking. You would struggle because it was normal. And normal, when it smells like smoke, wool, straw, and centuries of adaptation, takes time to learn how to breathe through. And as the days passed, something even more unsettling would happen. You would begin to realize that medieval hygiene was not chaotic. It was structured. It simply followed a logic that is no longer ours. Let's talk about clothing again, because in the medieval world, fabric was hygiene. Linen shirts, called chemises or shifts, were worn closest to the skin. These were changed more frequently than outer garments. The outer wool layers might go weeks, even months, without washing, but the linen beneath absorbed sweat and oils. When laundered and dried in fresh air and sunlight, linen did a surprisingly good job of reducing odor. So, in a quiet way, people were managing cleanliness. They just weren't scrubbing their skin daily. Full immersion bathing had complex social meaning. In earlier centuries, bathhouses had been popular in parts of Europe, but by the late Middle Ages, especially after waves of plague, public baths declined. Fear of disease shifted behavior. Warm water was believed to open pores. Open pores allowed corrupted air to enter the body, and corrupted air, according to prevailing thought, carried illness. So instead of soaking, people leaned toward dry cleanliness, brushing clothes, combing hair, airing bedding, washing hands and faces, changing linens. If you insisted on daily bathing, you might encounter raised eyebrows. Why are you opening your pores so often? Are you trying to invite illness inside? It would be difficult to explain germ theory without a microscope and several centuries of scientific development. Let's consider sanitation. In castles and large manor houses, toilets were often built into the stone walls. These were called garderobes. Waste dropped down vertical shafts into pits or moats below. The system worked, to a degree. In towns, chamber pots were standard. The contents were emptied into cesspits or directly into the street. Municipal regulations sometimes attempted to control this. In cities like York and Florence, ordinances required waste to be disposed of at certain times. But enforcement was uneven, infrastructure was limited, smell was simply part of urban life. Water sources were vulnerable, wells could be contaminated by nearby waste pits. Rivers served multiple purposes at once. The concept of separating drinking water from wastewater was still evolving. And yet, medieval people valued freshness in their own way. Herbs were hung inside homes. Floors were strewn with rushes mixed with aromatic plants. Windows, when weather allowed, were opened. Sunlight and airflow were understood, instinctively, if not scientifically, to improve living conditions. Even teeth, neglected as they sometimes were not completely ignored. Chewing sticks made from aromatic woods helped clean and freshen breath. Powdered sage, salt, or charcoal might be used. Dental pain was common, but people did attempt maintenance with the tools available. After several days, your modern expectations would continue to soften. The initial shock would fade into a sort of resigned anthropology. You would understand that medieval hygiene was shaped by labor, climate, technology, religion, and medical theory. It was not laziness, it was context. And here is the final discomfort. You would notice that people were used to each other in a way we are not. Physical closeness was unavoidable. Shared beds were common, especially in inns. Entire families slept in single rooms. Privacy, both visual and olfactory, was limited. You could not retreat into a sterile bathroom with scented soap and an exhaust fan. You lived inside the atmosphere of your household, which means survival depended less on smelling pleasant and more on accepting proximity. After 1 week, you might not collapse from disease, you might not faint dramatically in a muddy street, but you would feel tired, tired of smoke clinging to your hair, tired of scratching the occasional bite, tired of negotiating cold mornings without hot showers. And slowly, quietly, you would understand why medieval hygiene worked for them, because it was enough, not perfect, not pristine, but sufficient for survival in a world where daily life was already demanding. And if you finally returned to the modern era, stepped into a warm shower, and felt hot water run steadily over your shoulders, you would not take it for granted again. You would stand there, eyes closed, appreciating the silent miracle of plumbing, which, in its own very unexciting way, might be the greatest luxury in history. Now, if you are still with me, and still breathing gently through the centuries, you may be wondering whether medieval hygiene improved as time went on. The answer is yes. Slowly, reluctantly, without fanfare. By the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, some urban centers began to experiment more seriously with public sanitation. Certain cities attempted to regulate waste disposal, control animal movement within city walls, and maintain cleaner water supplies. It was not a revolution. It was more of a cautious nudge. In places like Venice, where water defined the city itself, maintaining relative cleanliness became a practical necessity. Canals required management. Waste could not simply accumulate indefinitely without consequence. Trade, wealth, and density forced adaptation. But the real shift in hygiene would not fully arrive until centuries later, with the gradual development of plumbing systems, waterworks, and, most importantly, scientific understanding of disease transmission. During the medieval period, however, People relied heavily on routine and rhythm. Laundry, for example, was a communal and seasonal task. Large batches of clothing were washed together in rivers or communal basins. Clothes were beaten against stones, boiled with lye-based soap, and dried in open air. It was labor-intensive and physically demanding. Doing this weekly would have been exhausting, so it wasn't done weekly. Beds were aired when possible. Mattresses were sometimes taken outside and beaten. Blankets were shaken. But the turnover rate was slow compared to modern expectations. And here is something important. Medieval bodies were acclimated. Skin microbiomes, though unknown to them, were different from ours. Frequent exposure to environmental bacteria likely shaped immune responses. When you grow up in a world without daily antibacterial cleansers, your body adjusts. That does not mean disease was absent. Far from it. But constant exposure did not always equal constant illness. The modern instinct to eliminate all germs is a recent phenomenon. In the medieval world, balance was the goal. Too much bathing was thought to weaken the body. Too little might allow dirt to accumulate excessively. Moderation, at least in theory, was prized. Now imagine you, still counting your 7th day. You have not showered. Your clothes have absorbed wood smoke from hearth fires. Your boots have survived several muddy streets. You have politely shared space in a crowded tavern where ventilation was theoretical at best. Your hair feels heavier. Your skin slightly coated. You have swatted at least one persistent insect. And yet, you are alive. This is the quiet truth. Medieval hygiene was unpleasant by modern standards. It was inconvenient. It was occasionally dangerous. But it was functional enough to sustain societies for centuries. The average person did not wake each morning in horror at their own existence. They adapted. They normalized. They found beauty in illuminated manuscripts, in cathedral ceilings, in harvest festivals, despite the ever-present background scent of humanity. You would not survive medieval hygiene for a week because it was fatal. You would struggle because it requires surrendering your modern expectations of sterility. It asks you to live closer to your environment, closer to animals, closer to other bodies, closer to smoke, earth, and water that is shared rather than purified, and that closeness can feel overwhelming. But it is also, in a strange way, honest. The medieval world did not hide the physical realities of life. It did not deodorize them. It simply accepted them as part of the human condition. So, as we gently drift away from torchlit streets and straw-filled mattresses, you might take comfort in one very modern luxury: running water that arrives quietly, obediently, and without the assistance of a servant hauling buckets. A small miracle. And if tonight you step into a warm shower, let the steam rise and think briefly about chamber pots, wool cloaks, and carefully managed linen shifts. You may find yourself oddly grateful, not dramatic, not triumphant, just quietly thankful that your pores are allowed to open without theological debate. And that, in the long, slightly smoky story of hygiene, might be enough to help you sleep. And just when you think we have reached the end of our gently unpleasant journey, there is one more quiet layer to consider. Medieval hygiene was not only about water and soap. It was about belief. Health was spiritual as much as physical. Illness could be a test, a punishment, or simply part of divine will. Cleanliness sometimes carried moral weight. A well-kept appearance reflected discipline. Excessive concern with the body, however, risked vanity. So people lived in a careful middle space. Clergy, for instance, navigated hygiene with caution. Some religious figures bathed rarely as a sign of humility. Others permitted limited bathing for health reasons. Ascetic practices occasionally included deliberate discomfort. The body was not always meant to be indulged. Meanwhile, royalty maintained higher standards, relatively speaking. Royal courts valued presentation. A king or queen could not smell aggressively medieval in front of foreign dignitaries. Yet even in grand castles, plumbing was primitive. Tubs were portable, water was carried. Perfumes did a significant portion of the diplomatic work. Consider Richard III or Isabella of Castile, figures who ruled in stone fortresses lit by torches and fireplaces. Their wardrobes were magnificent, their courts elaborate, and yet their daily hygiene routines would still feel startlingly minimal to us. Teeth were often damaged by diet. Bread contained grit from milling stones. Sugar, once introduced more widely, increased decay. Tooth pain was common. Dental extraction was abrupt. There were no gentle anesthetics waiting politely in sterile trays. And then there was the simple matter of time. Medieval life was labor-intensive, farming, cooking over open fires, repairing tools, mending clothes. These tasks filled daylight hours. Heating water for a full bath might take hours. That time had opportunity costs. Crops needed tending. Animals needed feeding. Winter daylight was limited. Bathing was not ignored because people did not care. It was deprioritized because survival required efficiency. You might also notice that medieval communities were less isolated from natural smells. Manure fertilized fields. Tanning leather involved pungent chemicals. Dyeing cloth used fermented substances. Even bread ovens contributed steady smoke to the air. The sensory environment was layered and constant. After a week, you would likely develop what we might call olfactory resilience. Your brain would filter the background. What initially felt unbearable would become texture. Humans are adaptable like that, and perhaps this is the quietest realization of all. Medieval hygiene only feels absolutely disgusting because we have recalibrated our standards over centuries of technological change. Indoor plumbing, sewage systems, antibiotics, soap refined to gentleness, hot water on demand. These are recent triumphs. They are not ancient defaults. If you lived your entire life in the Middle Ages, you would not compare your experience to a tiled bathroom with a rainfall showerhead. You would compare it to last winter. And if last winter you managed with fewer lice, fewer infections, and relatively dry bedding, you were doing quite well. So, would you survive medieval hygiene for a week? Yes, but you would not enjoy it. You would miss steam. You would miss fragrance that is not fighting for dominance. You would miss the quiet luxury of being alone with warm water and sealed pipes. And as we let the torches dim and the rush-strewn floor settle into shadow, you may find that the Middle Ages were not uniquely filthy. They were simply human, human in wool and smoke and shared rivers, human in adaptation and compromise, and human above all in the quiet persistence of getting through another day, without ever once imagining that one day, centuries later, someone would complain about low water pressure, which, if you think about it slowly enough, is a very modern problem indeed. And now, as we drift further into this softly smoky landscape, it's worth asking a slightly uncomfortable question. Were medieval people actually dirtier than everyone who came before them? Not necessarily. In fact, compared to some earlier rural societies, medieval Europeans maintained fairly structured habits. The real comparison problem comes from looking backward at the Romans. The Roman Empire, at its height, had built an impressive network of aqueducts, bathhouses, and sewage systems. Cities like Rome once enjoyed large public baths where citizens gathered not only to wash, but to socialize. Bathing was frequent. Infrastructure was sophisticated. When the Western Roman Empire declined, much of that infrastructure deteriorated. Aqueducts fell into disrepair. Urban populations shrank. Large-scale water management became harder to sustain. So medieval hygiene sometimes feels like a regression, but it was more of a transition. Communities reorganized around smaller populations and localized systems. Wells replaced aqueducts. Private washing replaced public bathing. The scale changed. Now, imagine you are in a small medieval village rather than a dense city. Life here is simpler. Fewer people, more open air. You work in fields, return home tired, eat bread and stew, and collapse into bed. Your washing might consist of splashing water on your face from a wooden basin, perhaps a cloth wiped down before Sunday church. It is not glamorous, but it is manageable. And interestingly, rural life could sometimes be healthier than city life. Lower density meant fewer outbreaks spreading rapidly. Fresh air was abundant. Water sources, while not sterile, were less contaminated by concentrated waste. Medieval cities were the true challenge. In dense trade hubs, places like Bruges or Cologne, crowds gathered for markets and commerce. Ships arrived. Goods flowed. So did disease. Fleas traveled efficiently. Rats did not require passports. And waste management systems struggled to keep pace. Here, the sensory overload would test you most severely. Narrow streets trapped smells. Tanneries produced sharp chemical odors. Slaughterhouses contributed their own distinct atmosphere. Combine this with limited bathing and heavy wool garments, and you have a world that is immersive. But again, people normalized it. They invested in small comforts. Clean linen was prized. Fresh herbs were valued. Some households sprinkled vinegar water to cut odors. Floors were swept. Dishes were rinsed. It was not chaos. It was maintenance within constraints. After a full week, your perspective would begin to shift from judgment to observation. You would see that medieval hygiene was deeply intertwined with economics. Soap cost money, fuel cost labor, time cost survival. You could not allocate modern levels of energy to cleanliness without sacrificing other necessities. You would also notice resilience. Children grew up in this environment and adapted. Adults carried on. Festivals were celebrated. Music was played. Marriages were arranged. Life did not pause because the concept of antibacterial wipes had not yet been invented, and perhaps that is what unsettles us most. The Middle Ages were not some perpetual disaster of grime and despair. They were functioning societies, complete with art, law, agriculture, and trade, operating within a different sensory baseline. You would survive medieval hygiene for a week, but you would feel constantly aware of your body, its smells, its textures, its vulnerability to environment. Modern life shields us from that awareness. Medieval life did not. And so, as we continue this gentle descent into wool cloaks and stone corridors, you may begin to sense something unexpected. Not admiration exactly, but respect. Respect for people who navigated a world without hot showers, without deodorant, without sealed plumbing, and still built cathedrals tall enough to brush the sky, which suggests that while they may have struggled with lice, they were not lacking in ambition. And if we linger just a little longer in this wool-lined world, there is one more quiet detail that often gets overlooked. Smell itself meant something different. Today, we divide scents into neat categories: pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. We design entire industries around eliminating odor. Medieval people, however, lived inside a far more layered sensory vocabulary. The smell of smoke meant warmth. The smell of animals meant food security. The smell of manure meant crops would grow. Not every strong scent was considered offensive. Some were simply informative. This does not mean medieval streets were delightful. It simply means their relationship to smell was less adversarial. Odor was not always something to conquer. It was something to interpret. Consider the marketplace: stalls selling fish, stalls selling cheese, fresh bread cooling in open air, herbs bundled in twine, leather goods drying after tanning, livestock shifting impatiently. It was a mixture that would overwhelm modern senses in seconds. But to a medieval shopper, it was normal commerce. And within that environment, hygiene became contextual. You washed before church not because bacteria were feared, but because respect was required. You combed your hair before meeting others because appearance signaled order. You cleaned your hands before meals because you were about to eat with them. There was intention. Even medical advice included hygiene elements. Physicians recommended airing rooms, avoiding stagnant air, and maintaining moderate habits. They just lacked the microscopic explanation. In times of plague, efforts intensified. Homes were fumigated with herbs. Fires were kept burning to cleanse air. Vinegar-soaked cloths were held to noses. The methods were imperfect, but the impulse to protect health was real. You, modern visitor, might still be counting insect bites, but you would also begin noticing patterns. Bedding is shaken in the morning light. Clothes are brushed before wearing. Floors are swept. Pots are scrubbed. These acts are not absent. They are simply scaled differently. And here is something gently ironic. Medieval people bathed their hands more often than some people today, not because of viral awareness campaigns, but because hands were constantly visible and constantly used. The face and hands were public. The rest of the body remained layered in cloth and privacy. By the end of your imagined week, you might find yourself adapting small habits, shaking out your bedding more carefully, airing garments in sunlight, appreciating linen's quiet efficiency. You would still long for a hot shower. You would still miss sealed sewage systems. But you would also understand that medieval hygiene was not laziness nor ignorance in the simplistic sense. It was an equilibrium built around technology, belief, climate, and labor. And that equilibrium sustained millions of lives for centuries. If anything, the Middle Ages remind us that our current standards are the result of long incremental progress. Aqueducts, wells, pipes, filtration, scientific theory, municipal planning, each layer built upon the previous. So as we sit quietly at the edge of this torchlit street, breathing in air heavy with smoke and humanity, we can acknowledge something softly humbling. They managed, not perfectly, not fragrantly, but persistently. And perhaps that is the most human detail of all. And as we near the end of this very slow, very smoky week, there is one final discomfort worth examining: privacy. Modern hygiene is deeply private. Bathrooms lock. Showers hum quietly behind closed doors. Deodorant is applied discreetly. We curate our scent for public interaction. Medieval hygiene, by contrast, was often communal. Bathing, when it happened, could be shared. In inns, multiple guests sometimes used the same tub of water, added sequentially rather than replaced. Not because anyone preferred it that way, but because heating water was expensive and efficiency was practical. Sleeping arrangements were equally intimate. Travelers shared beds with strangers. Entire families slept in single-room houses. Body heat was useful in winter. Personal space was limited. You would not only miss soap, you would miss solitude. Even grooming could be social. Hair was combed by relatives. Lice were removed by hand. Clothing repairs were done together. Hygiene was embedded in daily interaction. This constant closeness changed expectations. Bodies were not hidden behind layers of scented products. They were simply part of the environment. In larger medieval towns like Canterbury or Milan, inns catered to merchants and pilgrims. Beds were arranged efficiently. Privacy was secondary to shelter. After a long journey on muddy roads, comfort meant a roof and warmth, not necessarily fresh linens. And yet, medieval people still marked special occasions with deliberate cleanliness. Before weddings, before major feast days, before appearing in court, washing took on ceremonial meaning. Clean clothes symbolized renewal. Fresh linens represented dignity. So hygiene was not absent. It was episodic. And if you, determined modern visitor, insisted on daily bathing, you would quickly confront the physical limits of the era. Water must be drawn, wood must be chopped, fires must be tended. Each bath would consume hours of collective labor. After several days, you might quietly decide that a basin wash is sufficient. Because adaptation is persuasive, you would learn to appreciate small improvements. A fresh shirt, a newly aired mattress, a comb passed carefully through hair, the cool shock of river water on a warm afternoon. You would also understand how profoundly modern infrastructure has altered our expectations. Sewers running beneath streets, water heaters operating invisibly, soap engineered for gentleness. These are not inevitable features of civilization. They are achievements layered over centuries of trial and error. The medieval world functioned without them, not comfortably by our standards, but effectively enough to build cities, conduct trade, create art, wage wars, and raise families. And so, as we let this imagined week fade into torchlight and woolen shadows, the conclusion is not dramatic. You would survive medieval hygiene, but you would feel it in your skin, in your nose, in your longing for warm water that arrives without negotiation. And perhaps that is the quiet gift of looking backward. It reminds us that comfort is historical, that sterility is recent, and that for most of human history, being clean did not mean being scentless. It meant being presentable, practical, and prepared for another day, which, in a world of straw mattresses and stone walls, was already more than enough. And now, as the week gently closes and the torches burn lower, we arrive at something slightly uncomfortable. Medieval hygiene did not destroy medieval life. It shaped it. Disease was common, yes. Parasites were persistent. Infections were dangerous. But these realities were woven into a broader pattern of existence that people understood as normal. Life expectancy was influenced by many factors: war, famine, childbirth, labor, not simply by whether someone showered daily. We often imagine the Middle Ages as uniquely filthy. In truth, they were operating at the technological ceiling available to them. In cities like Vienna or Seville, civic authorities gradually introduced rules about street cleaning and waste disposal, Guilds regulated trades that produced strong odors, such as tanning or butchering. These measures were imperfect, but they revealed something important. People cared. They just lacked microscopes, plumbing networks, and chemical disinfectants. If you stayed longer than a week, if you truly embedded yourself in medieval life, you would stop measuring it against modern bathrooms. You would begin to measure it against survival, harvest yields, winter endurance, and social belonging. You would realize that the medieval relationship with the body was less about erasing scent and more about managing it. Wool cloaks aired in sunlight, herbs crushed between fingers, linen shirts laundered when possible, hands rinsed before breaking bread. These were not dramatic rituals. They were quiet adjustments. And here is one final gentle irony. Modern hygiene, for all its benefits, has created its own anxieties. Fear of germs, fear of contamination, entire industries built around eliminating invisible threats. The medieval world feared miasma, bad air, but it also accepted a baseline of physical reality that we now find alarming. Neither era is entirely calm. They simply worry about different things. So when we say why you wouldn't survive medieval hygiene, even for a week, what we truly mean is this: you would survive, but you would struggle to recalibrate. You would miss the predictability of hot water. You would miss privacy. You would miss the silent infrastructure humming beneath your feet. And perhaps, after returning to your own time, you would step into your bathroom with a new appreciation, not dramatic, not sentimental, just quietly aware that this small tiled room represents centuries of incremental change. From rivers shared with livestock, to pipes sealed beneath city streets, from straw mattresses alive with insects, to washable bedding rotated weekly without ceremony. The Middle Ages were not uniquely disgusting. They were human, operating within limits. And as we let the final embers settle in a stone hearth somewhere in the 14th century, you may find that what lingers is not horror, but perspective. Perspective on how recently comfort arrived. Perspective on how adaptable humans truly are. And perhaps, if you are very still, you can almost hear the distant splash of a wooden bucket being lowered into a well, followed by the soft, practical understanding that this, right here, is how cleanliness once began. And just when you think we have rinsed every possible medieval basin, there is still another quiet detail waiting patiently in the corner. Let us talk about illness again. Not dramatically, just gently. In the medieval world, recurring sickness was common enough that it blended into the background of life. Fevers came and went. Coughs lingered. Skin rashes appeared without ceremony. Without a scientific framework linking microorganisms to disease, hygiene was guided by observation and tradition. If a particular well seemed to produce illness, people might avoid it. If stagnant air in a cramped alley felt unhealthy, windows might be opened when possible. But the invisible mechanism remained unknown. During outbreaks, most famously the Black Death in the 14th century, fear reshaped behavior. Cities like Florence and London saw waves of devastation. People attempted quarantine measures. They burned fragrant woods. They carried herbs. They prayed. Bathing, ironically, sometimes declined further during plague years because warm water was thought to open pores and invite infection. The intention was protective. The result was complicated. From a modern perspective, this feels backwards. But without germ theory, without figures like Louis Pasteur centuries later demonstrating microbial life, The logic made sense within its own framework. And so, hygiene remained visible rather than microscopic. Clean clothes mattered, fresh air mattered, orderliness mattered, but sterility, as we define it, did not exist as a concept. Now imagine your seventh, eighth, ninth day. You have adapted somewhat. Your senses are less reactive. You have learned that linen truly does feel fresher after airing. You have mastered the art of a basin wash. Face, neck, hands, perhaps a brisk splash across shoulders if privacy allows. You are learning the rhythm. And this is perhaps the most unsettling realization of all. You would begin to normalize it. What once felt intolerable would become tolerable. What once seemed shocking would become routine. Humans recalibrate astonishingly fast. Medieval children grew up in this system and saw nothing extraordinary about it. They learned to comb their hair carefully. They understood that bedding needed shaking. They recognized that winter limited bathing opportunities. To them, this was simply life. The disgust we feel is comparative. It comes from contrast. And contrast only exists because centuries of engineering, science, and public health campaigns slowly altered the baseline. By the 18th and 19th centuries, sanitation reformers began to connect waste and disease more clearly. Urban sewer systems expanded. Soap became more affordable. Hygiene shifted from occasional maintenance to daily expectation. But in the medieval period, survival did not depend on smelling like citrus. It depended on harvest cycles, weather patterns, political stability, and the absence of famine. Hygiene was one variable among many. So when we imagine ourselves failing to survive medieval cleanliness, what we truly fear is discomfort. Persistent, unavoidable discomfort. The itch of wool, the weight of smoke and hair, the faint presence of something organic in the air at all times. But medieval people endured far greater hardships than scent. They endured crop failure, war, child mortality, unpredictable winters. In that context, slightly stale linen was not the central crisis, and so as we continue this slow walk through stone corridors and muddy lanes, it becomes clear that medieval hygiene was not a catastrophic flaw in civilization. It was a negotiation with available knowledge and resources, a negotiation that lasted centuries, and one that only gradually shifted as understanding deepened. You would survive. You would adapt. And eventually, you might even stop counting the days since your last proper shower, which is perhaps the most quietly disturbing possibility of all. And by now, as our imaginary fortnight approaches its soft conclusion, you may begin to notice something almost peaceful. Routine. Medieval hygiene, limited though it was, operated on repetition. Morning basins, linen changes when available, weekly or seasonal laundry, hair combed by firelight, bedding aired when the weather permitted. There is a rhythm to it. In monastic communities, this rhythm was especially structured. Monks followed schedules that governed prayer, work, meals, and rest. Hygiene fit into that cadence. Hands washed before communal eating, faces rinsed, hair trimmed in the distinctive tonsure, not because they feared bacteria, but because order reflected discipline, and discipline reflected devotion. In larger religious centers like Cluny, monasteries even maintained relatively sophisticated water systems for their time. Running channels directed water for washing and cooking. It was not modern plumbing, but it was thoughtful design. Meanwhile, in bustling towns, guild regulations sometimes restricted certain foul-smelling trades to specific districts. Tanneries, dye works, and Slaughterhouses were often located near rivers or city edges, not out of aesthetic refinement, but practical necessity. Medieval people did not adore foul smells. They managed them spatially. You, modern observer, might begin to realize that hygiene is inseparable from infrastructure. Without centralized sewage systems, waste remains local. Without water pressure, washing requires labor. Without affordable soap, scrubbing is harsh and infrequent. The Middle Ages were not missing cleanliness because of apathy. They were missing systems, and systems require engineering, investment, and scientific consensus, things that emerge slowly. By your 12th day, perhaps, you've found small comforts. A relatively fresh shirt feels luxurious. A river bath on a warm afternoon feels invigorating. The scent of rosemary tucked into bedding feels reassuring. Your expectations have narrowed to what is realistically attainable. And this narrowing is, strangely, calming. Modern hygiene promises constant freshness. Medieval hygiene promised adequacy. Adequacy is quieter, less glamorous, less stressful. You are no longer chasing absolute cleanliness. You are maintaining balance. The itch is manageable. The smoke fades into background. The proximity of others becomes less jarring. And perhaps, just perhaps, you notice something else. Medieval life required intimacy with the physical world. You were aware of weather on your skin, aware of the texture of cloth, aware of the smell of rain before it arrived. Hygiene was part of that sensory immersion. Modern life filters these sensations. Climate control stabilizes temperature. Synthetic fabrics repel odor. Ventilation systems remove scent before it accumulates. We live at a distance from our own bodies. They did not. So when we label medieval hygiene as absolutely disgusting, we are speaking from a place of technological privilege. It was unpleasant by our metrics, but it was sustainable by theirs. And sustainability, quietly, persistently, matters more than perfection. As we ease into the final stretch of this long, slow week, you may find your disgust softened into curiosity. Curiosity about how people endure. Curiosity about how standards shift. Curiosity about how comfort evolves. And perhaps, when you finally return to tiled floors and temperature-controlled water, you will pause, not dramatically, not triumphantly, just briefly, because history does not only remind us of suffering, it reminds us of adaptation. And adaptation, even in a world of wool and smoke, is a very human skill indeed. And now, as the days continue their slow procession beneath low stone ceilings, there is something almost philosophical about medieval hygiene. It forces us to confront a quiet truth. Cleanliness is cultural. In the medieval period, the body was understood through balance, moderation, and symbolism. It was not an object to be sterilized. It was a vessel to be maintained just enough to function. Too much washing could weaken you. Too little might make you socially undesirable. The middle path was safest. This belief was not random. It was built on inherited medical tradition from authorities like Hippocrates, and later reinforced by medieval scholars who interpreted classical texts through religious and practical lenses. Health was about harmony within the body and with the environment. So if the environment smelled of smoke, livestock, and damp stone, that was not automatically seen as catastrophic. It was the shared atmosphere of existence. You, meanwhile, come from a culture where scent is engineered. Artificial fragrances mask natural ones. Surfaces are disinfected daily. We treat visible dirt and invisible microbes with equal suspicion. Medieval people did not have that framework. Their concerns were different. Did your crops grow? Did your children survive winter? Did your neighbors respect you? If you managed those things, the faint scent of wool was not the most urgent problem. And this is where your discomfort would peak, not physically, but mentally. You would realize that your standards are not universal. They are historical. They are the product of urbanization, industrial soap production, plumbing systems, and scientific revolutions that arrived centuries after stone castles and wooden buckets. Even bathing itself, which we treat as a daily necessity, has fluctuated throughout history. In some medieval regions, warm baths were embraced more often. In others, climate or fear of illness limited them. The Middle Ages were not one uniform, grimy block of time. They were varied. In southern Europe, warmer climates allowed more frequent washing in rivers. In colder northern regions, winter restricted bathing opportunities severely. Geography shaped hygiene. By your 13th day, perhaps, your imagination has settled. You can picture the routine without recoiling. A wooden basin, cold water, a cloth. Hands first, face second, hair carefully combed. Linen changed when possible. Bedding aired in morning light. It is not ideal, but it is deliberate, and here is the quietest shift of all. You no longer view medieval people as unaware. You see them as operating within limits. Limits of infrastructure, limits of knowledge, limits of fuel and labor. They did not choose discomfort for its own sake. They chose practicality. And practicality, even when it smells faintly of smoke, is often more sustainable than perfection. So, would you survive medieval hygiene? Yes. You would adapt to its rhythms. You would lower your expectations. You would find satisfaction in small improvements. And in doing so, you might discover that comfort is not an absolute state. It is a moving target shaped by time, which means that centuries from now, someone may look back at us with our daily showers and scented products and find our habits equally strange. History has a way of leveling judgment, and that thought, perhaps, is strangely soothing. And as our long, slightly smoky meditation continues, we arrive at another gentle realization. Medieval hygiene was deeply seasonal. Winter was its own negotiation. Stone walls trapped cold, water froze, rivers hardened at the edges. Heating enough water for a full bath required a small forest's worth of effort. In northern regions, practicality almost always won the argument. So winter washing became minimal. Faces, hands, perhaps feet. Linen changed when possible. Heavy wool garments remained in loyal service for months. You, accustomed to hot showers in January without thinking twice, would feel this sharply. The idea of pouring cold water over yourself in a drafty room while frost gathers outside the window would test your resolve. But then spring would arrive. Warmer air made river bathing possible again. Clothes could dry outdoors. Sunlight did much of the work that modern dryers now perform quietly behind closed doors. Summer, meanwhile, brought its own complications. Heat intensified smells. Sweat accumulated faster beneath wool. Dust clung to skin. But it also allowed more frequent rinsing in streams or wells. Hygiene fluctuated with climate. It was responsive rather than rigid. In cities like Barcelona or Naples, warmer weather encouraged more outdoor washing practices. Further north, colder climates demanded conservation. There was no universal medieval hygiene manual. There was adaptation, and perhaps This is what makes the Middle Ages feel both foreign and strangely relatable. We still adapt. When water shortages occur, we shorten showers. When winter storms disrupt utilities, we conserve. When traveling without modern facilities, we improvise. The difference is that medieval improvisation was permanent. It was not an inconvenience. It was the system. By your 14th day, the initial shock would be distant memory. You would know how to layer linen effectively. You would know which corner of the house catches the most sunlight for airing bedding. You would understand that vinegar can cut certain odors better than water alone. You would have become competent, and competence reduces disgust. What once felt chaotic now feels procedural. The basin is filled, the cloth is dipped, the face is wiped, the hands are scrubbed, the linen is shaken. There is rhythm here, there is intention, and most importantly, there is continuity. Generations practiced these routines without imagining that one day people would describe them as absolutely disgusting. They were simply doing what worked, not perfectly, not fragrantly, but reliably enough to sustain communities, trade networks, monasteries, and kingdoms. And so, as we sit quietly in this imagined room of timber beams and flickering light, we can acknowledge something humbling. Modern hygiene is not proof of moral superiority. It is proof of technological accumulation. Plumbing, chemistry, microbiology, engineering. These layered slowly, century by century. Medieval people stood on earlier layers. We stand on theirs, which means the gap between us is less about intelligence or care and more about timing. And that thought, steady and unhurried, brings us closer to understanding rather than recoiling. Because history, even when it smells faintly of smoke and straw, is still ours. And as we move deeper into this long, wool-lined contemplation, we arrive at something even quieter than smell or soap. Habit. Medieval hygiene worked because it was habitual. You did not question whether to comb your hair. You did it. You did not debate airing bedding when the sun appeared after days of rain. You seized the opportunity. You did not expect endless supplies of fresh garments. You maintained the ones you had. Clothing was expensive. Fabric required labor, shearing, spinning, weaving. A linen shift represented hours of work. A wool cloak, even more. So garments were brushed, mended, patched, and protected. Hygiene was partly preservation. Sweat and dirt weakened fibers, so even without germ theory, people understood that care extended the life of clothing. This alone motivated regular maintenance. You, on your 15th day, might finally stop thinking in terms of when can I shower and start thinking in terms of how can I stay reasonably comfortable. The shift is subtle. Instead of eliminating odor, you manage it. Instead of washing daily, you rotate linen. Instead of expecting running water, you plan for it. In larger medieval towns such as Ghent or Nuremberg, communal wells became social spaces. Drawing water was not a private silent activity, it was shared labor. News traveled with buckets. Conversation happened over rope and pulley. Even hygiene had community embedded within it. You would learn to time your washing when fewer eyes were watching. You would accept that privacy is flexible. You would adjust your standards to match available energy. And here is something quietly fascinating. When everyone lives within similar limits, shame diminishes. If no one has access to daily hot baths, no one expects them. If wool cloaks carry smoke scent, that scent becomes neutral. Standards are collective, and collective standards stabilize society. Modern life often isolates hygiene as an individual responsibility. Medieval life distributed it across shared conditions. There were, of course, extremes. Wealth created separation. Royal courts layered perfume and luxury where possible. But even in castles, the fundamentals remained recognizable. Water carried, fires stoked, garments aired. You, modern traveler, might feel relief when rain falls. Rain freshens streets, clears air, washes rooftops. It becomes a natural cleansing cycle. And gradually, something unexpected would happen. Your discomfort would soften into curiosity. You would begin noticing details rather than recoiling from them. The way sunlight filters through narrow windows onto wooden floors, the scent of herbs crushed between fingers, the rhythm of brushing fabric by firelight. Medieval hygiene was not sterile, but it was sensory. And sensory life, while intense, is not automatically intolerable. By now, you might even feel a strange respect for your own adaptability. Humans can normalize almost anything when it becomes routine, which leads to a final, very quiet thought. Perhaps the Middle Ages were not defined by filth. Perhaps they were defined by endurance, endurance of labor, weather, illness, and yes, persistent smoke and clothing. You would survive, you would adjust, and eventually you would stop framing survival in terms of showers and start framing it in terms of balance. Balance between comfort and effort. Balance between cleanliness and fuel. Balance between expectation and reality. And in that balance, medieval hygiene makes a kind of practical sense. Not glamorous, not fragrant, but workable. And sometimes workable is enough. And by now, after more than 2 imagined weeks wrapped in wool and wood smoke, you may notice something surprising. Your outrage has faded. What remains is structure. Medieval hygiene was structured by constraint. Constraint of water access, constraint of fuel, constraint of knowledge. But within those limits, people built systems that functioned consistently enough to sustain towns for generations. Consider again the simple basin, a wooden bowl, water drawn from a well, a cloth. This was not laziness. It was a portable, repeatable solution. It required minimal fuel. It could be used indoors in winter. It conserved resources. Efficiency mattered more than indulgence. In trading hubs, such as Lubeck or Bordeaux, merchants traveled frequently. Inns accommodated turnover. Washing was practical, not luxurious. Travelers might rinse hands and faces after journeys, perhaps change linen if fortunate. The goal was restoration, not perfection. And here we begin to see the deeper divide between medieval and modern hygiene. Modern hygiene aims at elimination, eliminating odor, eliminating bacteria, eliminating visible imperfection. Medieval hygiene aimed at sufficiency, reducing the worst discomforts while conserving labor. This difference shapes everything. You would begin to understand why a full bath was occasional. It was labor-heavy and temporarily satisfying. A basin wash, on the other hand, was sustainable. You might also observe how medieval interiors were designed around this reality. Floors were swept rather than sanitized. Windows were opened for air exchange when weather permitted. Fireplaces, while smoky, also dried dampness that might otherwise foster mold. It was environmental management without chemical intervention. Even personal grooming tools were practical. Combs carved from bone or wood, small knives for trimming, cloths reused and rinsed, nothing disposable, everything maintained. By your 16th day, the itch of wool might no longer feel oppressive. It might simply feel normal. Your skin would have adjusted to less frequent washing. Oils would rebalance. The urgency to scrub everything daily would diminish. And perhaps that is the most quietly disorienting realization of all. Much of what we consider non-negotiable is negotiable. Daily showers feel essential because infrastructure makes them effortless. Remove that infrastructure and the definition of essential shifts. Medieval people were not living in constant misery because of hygiene. They were preoccupied with survival in broader terms. And yet, within that broader struggle, they still sought small improvements. Fresh rushes scattered across floors, herbs hung from rafters, linen bleached in sunlight. These gestures matter. They reveal intention. They reveal care. And care, even in a world of chamber pots and shared wells, is deeply human. You would survive medieval hygiene not because it was pleasant, but because it was coherent. It made sense within its world. And as we move slowly toward the final stretch of this quiet historical drift, perhaps the most important lesson is this: disgust is contextual. What feels unbearable at first can become routine. What seems primitive can reveal practical logic. And what smells faintly of smoke and livestock can, with enough time, simply become the background of daily life, which is both comforting and mildly unsettling at the same time. And now, as the days stretch on and the novelty of your discomfort has long since faded, we arrive at something even more subtle: expectation. Medieval people did not expect to feel perpetually fresh. That expectation did not exist. Freshness, as we define it, is a modern luxury, tied to plumbing networks, industrial soap production, heated water systems, and advertising campaigns that gently insist we must smell like citrus forests at all times. In the medieval world, expectation was calibrated differently. You expected to work, you expected to sweat, you expected your clothes to carry traces of your labor, you expected smoke in your hair if you sat by the hearth. This was not failure. It was evidence of participation in life. In towns such as Prague or Valencia, daily routines unfolded predictably. Bakers rose before dawn. Blacksmiths worked beside furnaces. Farmers tended fields. Their hygiene adapted around those tasks. Washing occurred when it could, not when an internal clock demanded it. You, however, would likely struggle most with the unpredictability. Water might be unavailable at convenient moments. Cold might deter bathing entirely. Laundry might depend on favorable weather. Modern hygiene is scheduled and controlled. Medieval hygiene was opportunistic, and this difference would challenge you more than the smell, because it removes autonomy. You cannot simply decide to feel clean. You must negotiate with resources. By your 17th day, your sense of time might shift. You might begin to measure cleanliness not in hours since your last shower, but in events: after market day, before Sunday Mass. After returning from travel, hygiene would attach itself to rhythm rather than routine. And slowly, you might even find something grounding in that. There is less pressure to maintain constant perfection, less urgency to eliminate every trace of bodily existence. You are allowed to be human, to sweat, to smell faintly of wool, to carry the scent of firewood in your hair. Medieval hygiene did not attempt to erase humanity. It coexisted with it. Of course, this coexistence came with risks. Infections were harder to prevent. Parasites were persistent. Disease spread more easily without sanitation systems. But within that reality, people were not passive. They experimented. They regulated trades. They aired homes. They improved wells when possible. Progress was incremental. You would survive medieval hygiene not because it was ideal, but because humans are remarkably adaptable to shifting expectations. And perhaps that is the most gently humbling lesson here. We assume our standards are obvious. They are not. They are historical, they evolved, and one day, centuries from now, our own routines may appear equally strange. Perhaps someone will marvel that we once stood daily beneath falling water inside ceramic rooms and considered it normal. History has a way of making everything relative, and that relativity, when considered slowly enough, becomes almost soothing, because it reminds us that discomfort is not destiny. It is simply context waiting to be understood. And now, as we continue this very patient journey, there is something almost meditative about medieval hygiene. It slows you down. You cannot rush water from a pipe that does not exist. You cannot heat a bath in 5 minutes. You cannot press a button and remove every trace of the day. You must plan. You must wait. You must accept. In cities like Toledo or Strasbourg, daily life unfolded at the speed of labor. Water was drawn bucket by bucket. Fires were coaxed to life slowly. Laundry was boiled in large vats outdoors. Hygiene followed that tempo. It was integrated into the day, rather than isolated from it. Modern life treats cleanliness as a quick reset. A shower separates before from after. Medieval life blurred those boundaries. Work, sweat, smoke, and rest overlapped continuously. You would likely notice how physical everything feels. Wooden floors under bare feet, cold water shocking skin awake, wool scratching at the neck, air that carries the memory of cooking fires. It is immersive. There is no sterile layer insulating you from sensation. And perhaps, after enough days, the immersion would stop feeling offensive and start feeling grounding. Your awareness of your body would sharpen. You would know when linen truly needs changing. You would know when bedding feels stale. You would recognize the scent of rain as relief. Medieval hygiene was reactive. It responded to immediate experience rather than abstract standards. And here is something quietly profound. The absence of constant artificial fragrance means natural smells carry meaning. Wood smoke signals warmth. Fresh bread signals nourishment. Clean linen, even if only slightly cleaner, signals effort. Smell was information, not merely something to suppress. By your 18th day, you would no longer think of survival in terms of endurance alone. You would think of it in terms of adaptation. You would have adapted your expectations, adapted your habits, adapted your definition of comfort, and perhaps you would realize that much of your original disgust came from comparison rather than reality. Medieval hygiene was imperfect, yes, but it was coherent within its ecosystem. It did not promise more than it could deliver. It did not demand constant improvement. It simply maintained equilibrium, and equilibrium, even when it smells faintly of livestock and hearth smoke, is sustainable. As we drift toward the final moments of this long historical immersion, it becomes clear that the Middle Ages were not a world without hygiene. They were a world with different thresholds, different tools, different priorities. You would survive, you would recalibrate, and eventually you might even find yourself appreciating the simplicity of a basin, a cloth, and sunlight through a narrow window, which is not glamorous. But it is human, and human across centuries has always been remarkably adaptable. And now, as we approach the end of this long and gently smoky experiment, something else becomes clear. Medieval hygiene was not a failure of civilization. It was civilization at a different stage. We often imagine history as a ladder, each step cleaner, brighter, more advanced than the last. But lived reality is less tidy than that. Medieval towns were not simply dirty waiting rooms for modern plumbing. They were functioning systems optimized for their own constraints. Water flowed where gravity allowed it. Waste was managed as best as knowledge permitted. Linen was washed when labor and weather aligned. Herbs were used because they were available. Smoke was tolerated because it meant warmth. Everything had trade-offs. In bustling trade centers like Venice or Antwerp, merchants navigated crowded docks, warehouses, and narrow streets layered with the scent of goods from across continents. Spices masked odors. Salt preserved fish. Trade expanded sensory complexity rather than reducing it. Hygiene adapted accordingly. You, by your 19th day, would no longer measure survival by comfort alone. You would measure it by coherence. Does the system function? Do people continue to live, work, worship, and trade? Yes. And that coherence is what sustained the medieval world. It is easy to imagine that if transported back in time, you would collapse from disgust. But humans are astonishingly flexible. Given enough repetition, almost any environment becomes background. Your nose dulls. Your skin adjusts. Your expectations shift. And perhaps most importantly, you would begin to see that medieval people were not indifferent to cleanliness. They simply prioritized differently. They did not ignore dirt. They managed it within limits. They did not celebrate filth. They tolerated it where removal was impractical. They were negotiating daily between effort and necessity. That negotiation is not so foreign after all. Even today, we weigh convenience against comfort. We choose when to clean deeply and when to accept temporary disorder. The difference is scale and infrastructure, not instinct. So when we say medieval hygiene was absolutely disgusting, what we often mean is that it does not align with our present-day expectations of sanitation. But expectation is historical, and history moves slowly. As we prepare to step quietly back into a world of tiled bathrooms and quiet plumbing, perhaps the most enduring thought is this: the Middle Ages were not defined by a lack of care. They were defined by limited tools. And with limited tools, people did what they could. They washed when possible. They aired bedding when sunlight cooperated. They carried herbs to sweeten air. They endured. And endurance, even when wrapped in wool and wood smoke, is a very human achievement indeed. And now, as we reach the end of this very long, very patient week, perhaps two, perhaps more, we can finally let the torchlight dim. You have walked muddy streets. You have endured wool in summer and cold water in winter. You have shared air with livestock, neighbors, merchants, monks, and travelers. You have learned the art of the basin wash. You have aired linen in sunlight like it is a small triumph. And you are still here, which is the point. You would survive medieval hygiene, not because it was pleasant, not because it was healthy by modern standards, but because humans adapt faster than their complaints. The Middle Ages were not an era of people permanently overwhelmed by their own scent. They were people embedded in their environment, close to earth, animals, fire, and one another. Hygiene existed within that closeness. It was imperfect, it was limited, but it was functional. In cities such as London, Florence, or Prague, daily life continued for centuries without hot showers. Markets thrived, universities formed, cathedrals rose skyward, laws were written, art was painted, all without antibacterial body wash. And that quiet fact is perhaps the most humbling of all. We tend to assume that comfort is necessary for civilization. History gently suggests otherwise. Civilization persists first. Comfort follows later. As you step back into your own time, into a bathroom where water appears instantly, where drains carry waste invisibly away, where soap is engineered to smell faintly of something tropical, you might pause for just a second, not in horror at the Middle Ages, but in appreciation of plumbing. Because plumbing is not ancient. It is the product of accumulated insight, engineering, public health reform, and centuries of small adjustments layered atop worlds that once relied on buckets and wells. Medieval hygiene was not a moral failing. It was a logistical reality. And like all logistical realities, it made sense within its boundaries. So perhaps the true reason you wouldn't survive medieval hygiene is not that it would kill you. It is that it would force you to confront how recent your expectations are, how quickly you have grown accustomed to warmth on demand, how deeply you rely on systems you rarely see, and how adaptable you would become if those systems quietly disappeared. History does not always shock. Sometimes it simply recalibrates. And as the fire settles into embers and the straw mattress waits patiently in the corner, you may find that what lingers is not disgust, but perspective. Perspective that comfort is historical. Perspective that endurance is universal. And perspective that, for most of human existence, cleanliness was not about smelling like lavender. It was about doing just enough to greet another morning. And that, softly and without drama, was always enough.